With World War II raging, Allied and Axis powers alike were desperately searching for a weapon that would give them final, decisive power over the outcome. Research and experimentation with nuclear weapons were underway. Determined to beat the Nazis in creating an atomic weapon, the United States poured money and resources into enormous projects that required massive manpower. In 1942, the Army Corps of Engineers was tasked with building the facilities where the work would be carried out. They needed a secluded place with little to no population and an abundance of cold-flowing water. In a desert basin in southeastern Washington, they found their ideal spot. With the indigenous tribes long forced out, there was only a small population, and the powerful Columbia River provided the constant water flow needed. The Army Corps of Engineers and the contractor, the DuPont Company, began to build a nuclear facility for the Manhattan Project on what was dubbed the Hanford Reservation. To fill the labor vacancy, the DuPont Company actively recruited workers in the American South.
Leaders of the company understood that wages in the South were much lower than other parts of the country, so they could entice people much more likely from the South, because these were the jobs in Hanford, these were good paying jobs. But you'd be much more willing to move there if you knew it was going to be 2 to 3 or 4 times what you're currently making, versus if it was about the same, right? So they knew these would be jobs that would, or the pay would entice people from the South, because it would be definitely significant increase in their pay, yeah.
The best and highest paying jobs went to white workers, but DuPont enticed black workers to relocate as well. To recruit workers, DuPont promised jobs they had no intention of giving to black employees.
For black women, that was the case. I think most black men understood that they'd be working construction, that was primarily what they would be hired to do. I think there was hope that there might be some other things available, but black women were told that there were clerical jobs available, that they would be able to work in those sorts of jobs. And when they got here, they found out that was not the case, that they could work only as maids, cooks, waitresses, those sorts of jobs, which were lower paying and sort of lower status as well, right? So, so there was some, definitely some of that, especially for black women.
We came to Hanford from Mary Island Navy Yard in California. I was working on the Mary Island Navy Yard, and my husband was working. He was a cement finisher, and I was a welder, and I went to school, that welding school. And they say I learned how to weld quicker than any student went through that school. And I thought I would get a welding job in Pasco, but I didn't. We went to work at the mess hall.
Upon arriving in Washington, black employees found the Hanford facilities completely segregated.
Living quarters were segregated, so there were barracks for white men, barracks for black men, barracks for white women, and barracks for black women. The mess halls or dining halls were segregated. Entertainment was segregated. This was kind of remote at the time in the 1940s, a place that most people had no idea existed before they came here. They had some, we get wind here and we get dust storms, and back then it was worse because there's a lot less grass that had been laid at that point, right? So it was, anytime the wind really blew, there was dust, and in these hastily constructed housing and barracks, dust would blow right through. And they called these winds termination winds because a lot of people would just leave if there was a really bad dust storm. So forget it, I don't want to stay here. So even if the wages are good, I'm going to go to Seattle, and there's got to be something, something that pays just as much that I don't deal with this stuff. So to try to entice people to stay, they had entertainment. And so they would bring in sometimes nationally known entertainment figures, music, that had dancing and whatever, comedians, just to give people something to do that would hopefully entice them to stay. But the entertainment was completely segregated, so there are, you can see monthly, calendars for the Hanford site. They had entertainment calendars, so you could see what the entertainment was for each month. But for each day on the calendar, it would say white, and it would list what the entertainment was for whites, and then colored, and what the entertainment was for blacks at Hanford. So that was segregated as well.
Mess hall worker Lula Mae Little said, Hanford was the Mississippi of the North.
Very prejudiced, very racist. And I was surprised when I came here to find a place that I had left a few years back from Mississippi, and came here and found the same thing that I found in Mississippi.
DuPont's segregated busing system was challenged by the black workers at Hanford, who had contacted the nearest chapter of the NAACP. Eventually, the issue worked its way up to the attention of Thurgood Marshall, who in turn wrote to state and federal officials demanding an end to the segregation on buses at the Hanford project. It took 4 months for DuPont to end the segregated busing system. Not only was Hanford strictly segregated, the nearest towns of Richland, Kennewick, and Pasco, which make up the Tri-Cities, were segregated as well.
There was, a system of segregation put in place very quickly here, and it was really a combination of the DuPont Company policy, of the Army Corps of Engineers policy, and it was also state and local officials also, and the population that was already here. I mean, so it was, sometimes when I talk about this in my classes, or people asking about this, there's an assumption that racism against blacks was brought by Southern whites, right? And that's part of the story, yes. And there's sort of racial expectations that Southern whites brought with them. But the racism was not just from Southern whites, but also from whites who were already here, and from, systemic racism through all levels of government as well. So it was broadly throughout, right, society here, and at all levels, yeah. Each of the cities had their own system of segregation put in place, and for different reasons, sort of. So Richland, because it, during the war, and even for a few years after the war, was fully a federal city. It was run by the federal government. And you had the connection to the Army Corps of Engineers, and Army policy during World War II was segregation. So in Richland, the federal government said, if you can live in Richland if you are a permanent employee of Hanford. And it was the federal government and DuPont that agreed on this. But if you were not a permanent employee, you could not live in Richland. So African Americans could not be permanent employees. They were excluded from being permanent employees, which meant that they could not live in Richland. So rather than directly prohibiting, right, saying we're not going to allow African Americans to live here, they said, well, they can't be permanent employees, so therefore they can't live here. So Richland was sort of unique in that sense because it was a federal city at the time. Kennewick quickly established racially restrictive covenants that prohibited anyone who was not Caucasian from living in housing in Kennewick. So if you were to buy an older home in Kennewick, a house that was built in the 20s or the 40s or something along those lines, now in the paperwork you would find a document that would say something along those lines, that no one who is not of the Caucasian race will live here, and was signed by whoever bought the home or owned the home at the time. And so that kept Kennewick all white, and the city of Kennewick prided itself in being lily white, as they called it. And then the city of Pasco did not completely exclude blacks from living there, but blacks were not allowed to live west of the railroad tracks. So as I mentioned, Pasco is a railroad town. So the main part of the railroad hub, right, west of that, African Americans could not live. So this was really the sort of essentially the older industrial area with rundown housing and little running water through most of that part of Pasco. No garbage service at all, and that was the part of Pasco where blacks were allowed to live. So if you were black and you came to work at the Hanford site, you came because of the wages. And I and my colleagues have interviewed a number of people who came here enticed by the wages. And they were like, I mean, this was a lot of money compared to what they had been earning, a lot more. And so they're very excited about that. And then they realized they had two housing options. One was the barracks on the Hanford site, which were segregated, or East Pasco. And those were really the options. A handful of black workers actually lived in Yakima, which is an hour away, because there was more housing options there. You didn't have this really rigid segregation set up there. But the vast majority of blacks did not choose that because it was too far away. So most lived either in the barracks on the site or in East Pasco. And the housing there really was, I mean, for the most part, very small shacks is probably the best way to describe them. You know, maybe 10 by 12, maybe some of them bigger than that, but with, again, no running water. Interviewed one man, his name is C.J. Mitchell, who actually came here in the early Cold War years in 1947. He's 16 years old because his uncles were here and they had moved up here and were working, and they said, "Row back, we're making good money, you should come," you know, so he came up. But they were living basically in a shack in East Pasco. They didn't have room for him, so he lived in a tent outside their shack for about 3 or 4 months, I think, until eventually moving into the segregated barracks.
Many businesses in the Tri-Cities had signs that declared they would not serve black people, and sometimes white workers would protest the presence of black workers.
There was no freedom to move in Kennewick because there was only one grocery store in the Tri-Cities at that time stayed open after midnight, and it was Tri-City Foods. And if you go across the river to that store, the police were sitting out there somewhere, and if you went anywhere like you was going downtown, they would stop you and tell you was on the wrong side of the river.
Needed services were denied to blacks in the Tri-Cities. To find a doctor or a dentist who would accept black patients required an hour-long drive to the town of Yakima. While black people worked to build community, they were hindered by the Manhattan Engineer District, which set a quota for how much of the employee population could be black.
The range was 10 to 20%. The leadership of the site really tried to keep it at 10% or close to it. Their argument was that the Southern whites who had come up for jobs would not tolerate a higher percentage than that of blacks. They wouldn't want to work with more blacks than that.
The constant racism was ever present for black citizens in the Tri-Cities. The Pasco police even invented a crime called investigation, for which they could arrest black people without cause.
Investigation doesn't sound like a crime, right? But it was a way to justify pulling over black motorists or even blacks on the street for questioning for no real reason other than that they were black, and to see if there could be something that they could find that they could arrest them for. It was, you know, blacks today will sometimes talk about the crime of driving while black. It was sort of that, right? Just being black in Pasco meant that this could happen to you.
Black Tri-Citians fought prejudice where they were able to. They established their own communities and churches. Reverend Samuel Coleman created the first black church in Pasco in 1944 on his property that was west of the railroad tracks. Having been in Pasco before the war, Coleman and his wife Gladys had been part of the small black population that was deemed non-threatening by their white neighbors. Gladys was the first black student to graduate from Pasco High School. With the influx of black workers that came with the Manhattan Project, Coleman asked the city for permission to build housing on his property for black workers, which was quickly answered by a petition from whites in the area to prevent it. Coleman then switched his focus to providing a church for black workers. The Pasco City Council did its very best to try and stop him. It told Coleman that if he surrendered his property west of the railroad tracks, they would give him property east of the tracks, and the city would run sewer and power lines to it. Coleman refused. The city then began changing regulations to try and obstruct any progress on the facility. After Coleman had toilets installed in the church, the city altered the requirements and said he had to connect the building to the city's sewer system first.
One thing to remember again is the termination winds. A lot of workers, white and black, didn't stay for the duration of the war. They got here, enjoyed the wages, but then a really bad windstorm, dust storm would hit and they would leave. So there were roughly, estimate about 15,000 African Americans who worked here at some point during the war. Not all of them stayed. There weren't 15,000 here when the war ended. But I mean, there were probably peak about 5,000 at any given time. But yeah, once the war ended, the sort of belief, right? Well, this was a wartime project, right? We built this project, didn't really know what we were building for, and it was for the war, but exactly what it was, workers didn't really know that they were building an atomic weapon or the plant that was going to create an atomic weapon. But it was a wartime thing, and so most employees left. You know, they kept a smaller, much smaller group of workers here, but for the most part, most people left because the war was over. And then, of course, within another year or two, the Cold War is going to ramp up, and then you have another really significant wave of workers brought in, and a significant number of black workers brought in because of the Cold War. And during the war, again, a lot of African Americans were only here temporarily, but they did try to challenge some of these things that were happening. And we were successful, at least in that bus transportation instance, we're successful in doing that. And when you have a more sort of permanent black community established during the Cold War, then you see even more of that, right? Then you start to have local chapters of the NAACP or the Congress of Racial Equality or other civil rights organizations that are going to try and challenge some of the housing segregation or the job issues or segregation and discrimination, those sorts of things. So the system is put in place, and from very early on, African Americans try to figure out ways to deal with that, but also ways to challenge it. And I think that is important to understand too.